That's
Well,
good.
good evening, everybody. We're just at 7:05, so I'm sure others will continue to join us, but we have a fantastic gathering here this evening, and everybody is very welcome to this webinar, which is exploring energy accounting, a neurodiversity affirming approach to stress and burnout. In this webinar, over the next hour and 10 minutes or so, we're going to be, I suppose, exploring in conversation, Maja and I, and self-exploring, making adjustments to improve quality of life. As within Maya's book, which is called Energy Accounting, Stress Management and Mental Health Monitoring for Autism and Related Conditions, she takes a neurodiversity affirming approach, and we're certainly going to be taking that approach tonight. This is an approach that Maya takes as a clinician and in which we'll be, I suppose, acknowledging both strengths and also the resources people need and recognizing the very real life challenges that may require adaptive strategies for the individual. At the outset, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Maja Toudal. Maja is a long-standing friend of AsIAm. Maja is an autistic and ADHD psychologist, speaker, and author from Denmark. Her first book, entitled What Your Autistic Child Wants You to Know, combines her personal and professional perspectives to advise parents on the inner lives of autistic children. Currently, she focuses on clinical work and future book projects, as well as her podcast, Autistic Tidbits and Tangents, which she hosts alongside Dr. Dymond and Bruce Petherick. And it was an absolute pleasure for AsIAm to host Maja at our national conference a number of years ago, where we explored the topic of energy accounting, and we still receive fantastic feedback on that to this day. And it's a topic that we find ourselves returning to again and again. I'm also particularly delighted that Maja is a member of the scientific committee for the forthcoming Autism Europe Congress, which takes place in Dublin from the 11th to the 13th of September this year. And Maja will also be a keynote speaker at that event. Just before we get started, I suppose the webinar this evening, it's going to be discussion based, so we won't be using slides. I'll be interviewing Maja for the first segment of this evening, and there will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions. As with all AsIAm webinars, so we can maximize the reach, tonight's webinar will be recorded. Once we get through the kind of more formal format this evening, we're going to turn to the Q&A box, and we're going to give plenty of time to hear the questions that you want asked. Please don't put any identifying information in your questions. We will leave that out for obvious reasons. And just to remind people that the webinar, again, is being recorded. But I just want to get straight into it and to welcome Maja. And we're going to start, I suppose, because the title is Energy Accounting. Many of us this
Yeah.
evening might know about this title. For others, it might be our first time hearing this term. So I suppose
Yeah.
just to start really simply, Maja, I just wanted to ask you maybe to give us an explanation of what is energy accounting.
Yeah. So energy accounting is a visual and structured method, which is really all about discovering and learning about your own stressors and your strategies for stress management, for stress prevention, and also for enhancing your well-being and your quality of life. And this is really about really looking at the individual person rather than having that set program for, oh, this is stress and this is how we're going to deal with it. No, every single person that we want to help is an individual, and therefore we have to make sure that the method energy accounting can be adapted.
Thank you so much. And I suppose, why is this specific approach supportive to autistic people?
Well, like I said, because it can be tailored to the person. So it's not trying to fit us into a box. And also as well, because many of us do like to work with methods that are visual and structured and really make use of our pattern recognition, which energy accounting also leans into. We also in energy accounting try to make things a little bit concrete, which I find to be certainly the approach to take, because stress, well-being, those are things that are very vague.
Yes.
And especially if you've also got, which many of us do, difficulties with interoception, we really want to work towards making things as concrete as possible, putting them on pieces of paper, trying to work with them in that very visual way. The other thing is that in energy accounting, we want to validate each person's experience. So that extends also to the hopes and desires, which is really my foundation, honestly, because I think this maybe goes a bit further than the question, but when I started learning about stress and when I was trying to deal with my own stress, um, everything was very sort of focused on these are the things you have to try
Hmm.
to achieve, you know, a job, independent living, sort of very um, allistic focused, very
Hmm.
non-autistic focused, and not at all focused on what it is the autistic person actually wants. And so in energy accounting, I kind of take the opposite approach and go, okay,
Yes.
well, what do you actually want? Let's work towards that instead of trying to make you fit into a world that doesn't accommodate you.
I think
Um,
that's really important. And I think one of the things I was very interested in is this idea of balancing the deposits, which is obviously kind of core to the whole process. And I suppose, uh, how do you go about it as an autistic person, placing the appropriate weight in terms of how much you attribute to a withdrawal versus how much you attribute to a deposit? You might know that
yeah.
both are, you might know what gives you energy and what takes it away, but how do you work out the quantity of that withdrawal or deposit?
Yeah, and that's why I say that energy accounting isn't it's not ever going to be one size fits all because it's so much about the individual. So what we usually will begin with is say, okay, let's find a value estimate.
Hmm.
Let's find a range
Okay.
of numbers that can fall into because the same activity can be a very different weight or value of energy deposit or withdrawal on a given day. Because people are dynamic, our energy is dynamic, our stress capacity is dynamic. It changes day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. But also that energy accounting is actually a journey of self-discovery because we can't know from day one. If we knew that, we wouldn't need energy accounting.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's actually very much about saying, okay, we're going to try. We're going to try putting some numbers on it, and we're going to figure out if they're right or not. And then we're going to adapt and we're going to tweak things and we're going to say, no, that number definitely wasn't correct. Let's try something else. Is this more correct? And so there is a bit of, trial and error in that process. But I think by now, after 10 years of clinical implementation and testing, we've got a
Yes.
framework that people can start with and not not make too many mistakes, quote unquote.
A question that we were speaking about briefly before we came online this evening that I was interested in your view on was, I suppose, for me as someone who tries to balance energy and succeeds and fails depending on the day and the week, the contradiction sometimes that can exist whereby the very
Mm.
things that give you energy, so in my case, being out and about meeting people, can also be the things that mean you're absolutely floored at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of balancing the books, but I suppose
Mhm.
how do you plan for that, or how would I suppose a well balanced book enable somebody to plan for that?
Yeah. So what you're describing is very common actually. We tend to hear that myth, right, of autistic people being introverts and not being very socially interested, but in fact, many of us are, and especially those of us who are ADHD tend to have that juxtaposition of needing that alone time, but also needing new things and excitement and going out into the world and
Hmm.
getting that energy from new experiences. And so that can be very difficult to balance. And the thing is to get that awareness of how long can I do it for without going in the red, and
Okay.
how once I've spent the amount of energy that's safe to spend.
Mhm.
How do I then recharge for the next day?
Mhm.
And sometimes some of us can't do that from day to day. We have to
Yeah.
plan it throughout a whole week. And I will also tag this on that I'm very different in the approach when I work with children versus adults. Because children, I really don't want to push those young nervous systems and those young brains. I
Mhm.
don't want to push them into stress throughout the week and then say, well, we can use the weekend to recover. No, we can't. We have to balance that because those very young brains and nervous systems really can't cope with
Mhm.
those levels of stress. We've learned that by now from the science. We know it. And so I'm much more careful working with children, whereas an adult, we can often do that kind of larger strategy, look at the whole week
Yes.
and be like, okay, how can we make sure the week is balanced? We know
Yes.
there are going to be some very, very difficult mornings where it's hard to get started, but that's okay. We can work with that. Yeah.
And I suppose if we were talking about a financial bank account and we were doing a financial planning session this evening, the bank manager might tell you about the importance of putting some money aside for a rainy day or to deal with unforeseen events that might occur that might strain your finances.
Yeah.
How do you plan a contingency within energy accounting?
Yeah. And so I tend to think very visually, surprise. I always think in terms of people's stress capacity and knowing that within that capacity, there's going to be a point at which people show kind of warning signs, and there's going to be a point at which now it's critical. I want to have space in that capacity so that every day we don't actually reach the warning signs line within the budget, because then those unforeseen events, um, and that can be anything from traffic being a little bit more difficult than usual, or I didn't get my morning coffee right at the right minute. It can be small things, but it could also be much larger events. It leaves that little bit of wiggle room.
Mhm.
And there will still be days that we do cross that line and that we
Mhm.
do begin to show warning signs, for example, some irritability, or maybe we get a headache or a stomach ache, or you know,
Mhm.
needing to vent, or there can be many, many different symptoms that we show depending on the person. Um, there will be days that happens anyway. But leaving that room for the unforeseen events is what we want to be doing.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose the reason we're doing all of this is to avoid that going into the red, or at least going into the red in the long term. And
Yeah.
we might call that bankruptcy in financial terms, and we might call that burnout in energy terms. And
Yeah.
this is a topic very interesting to me. It's something that I would have experienced myself in the last year or so and written about. So that's why I was so keen to have this conversation this evening. But I suppose just to talk a little bit, I think we all hear the word burnout. It gets bandied around. It's quite a day-to-day term, as many terms, I suppose, increasingly that are
Yeah.
important to our community can kind of get generalized. But
Mhm.
what is autistic burnout, and I suppose what makes it distinct to other forms of burnout?
Yeah. So, I think that's an important question, and I want to be very clear that on the nervous system level, autistic burnout is not actually different as such from employment burnout or from parental burnout or any other form of burnout. On a nervous system level, it's the same thing. But the causes and duration is where there's a difference. So for autistic people, our stress begins at a very young age. Um, I do want to mention a theory very briefly, and there is a book about this, and if people are interested, they can go and find it. So there's a theory called predictive coding, which I learned about when I was writing my thesis, which explains how much extra load there's actually on our brains from the moment of birth. because the way that we process information, sensory and social information, is different. The book that you want to look out for is by Peter Vermeulen, and
Mm.
it's called Autism and the Predictive Brain. It's excellent, and definitely look at that. And then on top of that, very early on in life, many of us begin masking as well. And so our stress begins at a different moment in time from allistic people, from neurotypical people, whatever we want to call the section of the population that doesn't suffer childhood stress in the same
Mm-hmm.
way. That's really where the difference lies, in that our burnout builds up over years and years and years and years and years. And because we also couple that with very often different processing of interoceptive information, we don't necessarily register the burnout until it's gone to the extreme. Um, there's also, unfortunately, the tendency that our burnout is dismissed as a part of our autism,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very often acceptable uh, from professionals and from schools and everything that autistics just, we just have that anxiety, or yeah, we just have that tendency towards depression or whatnot. And so those signs that burnout is getting really quite severe, they get dismissed as something you just have to deal with. And so we get pushed very often to the point that we actually lose function in a very different way. And also because it's built up over so many years, it takes longer for us to recover. And so where someone else in experiencing employment burnout, for example, that
Mm-hmm.
may have built up over the course of a year or even 3 months that have just been very, very tough. And they can go into rest and recovery, and maybe in 6 weeks, 3 months, half a year, they're okay.
Mm-hmm.
They still have to make changes to their life in order to not risk future burnout,
Mm-hmm.
but their recovery period tends to be shorter.
Okay.
And the changes they have to make to their lives in order to make them function on the other side of it also tend to be more socially acceptable.
When I think about, I suppose, my last period of burnout, I think about things like, having so much to do and feeling unable to start anything, feeling
Mm.
about things that were usually really enjoyable and getting no enjoyment from them at all,
Yeah.
finding it incredibly difficult to just get started on a day-to-day basis. And I suppose at the time that seemed quite new, but then when I reflected back, I suppose, well, that was my first maybe period of kind of an extended burnout as an adult.
Mhm.
I feel there was times growing up as a as an older
Yeah.
child and as a teenager where very similar experiences happened and then in time passed as well. Is there a cyclical element to this for many autistic people?
Yeah, for many of us, especially those of us with perceivedly lower support needs, those of us that continue to pressure ourselves into, shall I say, the holistic world, you know, continuing going to school, going onwards into employment, trying to live up to that expectation of doing what others can do, or perhaps even more because we've got something to prove.
Yeah.
Um, that segment especially tends to push themselves continuously into burnout and then have to recover and find a way to sort of make things work. But then they end up doing the same thing again. And it's the unfortunate part of it is that, again, because we go back to when our stress begins, the earlier that you've been exposed to high levels of stress, the more at risk you are of developing burnout again and again and again.
And this is, I suppose, leads on perfectly to the next question I was going to ask. So, we hear
Mhm.
about people come out through burnout and, feel in a much better place again, really
Mhm.
keen to re-engage in their area of work or in day-to-day
Yeah.
life. What are the kind of top tips for building back? You don't want to obviously go from one extreme to another or find yourself back where you were very quickly. So, what are the sorts of considerations people should, I suppose, have as they come out of burnout?
Yeah. So there's lots of things.
Yeah.
The first thing is that recovery, rule of thumb, and this doesn't really apply when we're talking about the whole lifespan, which it is for autistic people, but in other forms of burnout, we say rule of thumb, it takes as long time to recover as it took you to get into burnout.
Okay.
With autistic individuals who tend to have been under stress for years and years and years, I tend to say it's not that it's going to take you 20 years to recover.
Hmm.
It's that you have to recognize that it's not going to take 3 months or half a
Okay.
year. It's going to take time because the nervous system takes a long time to heal, in part because um, one of the things that happens in stress is that cortisol actually damages the part of the brain that creates new brain cells, which is the hippocampus. And so that has to repair and then repair everything else. So the nervous system does actually heal itself, but it takes time and it takes for it to have that space. So that's one thing. Um, is to make sure that you've got that time. The other thing that I really want to emphasize is that never try to go back to what you were capable of doing before. Lots of people, when they go into burnout and then they start treatment, they start that recovery process. They think, oh, I want to get back to where I was. But
Hmm.
that's not going to work because what was what brought you into burnout in the first place. So if you go back to that, you're going to go back into burnout, and then you've just got that cycle.
Hmm.
So what we need to do in that recovery phase is actually figure out what is realistic. What is the life that we can create that will not hopefully result in another burnout?
Hmm. That's
And
really
that's tricky, but that's the goal that we're trying
that's
to
the
do,
goal.
to actually become proactive in stress management, which is why energy accounting talks so much about mental health monitoring, because it's not just about the recovery, it's about monitoring afterwards to make
On a
sure
day
it
to
doesn't
day.
happen again.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose we referenced in the introduction this evening the concept of neurodiversity affirming support. And I
Hmm.
suppose what we're talking about this evening in terms of energy accounting is a neurodiversity affirming way to both prevent and support people through burnout and stress. But I suppose sometimes it's as important for us to call out examples of approaches that people may advocate that aren't neurodiversity affirming when it comes to burnout and stress. So I suppose, can you give some examples of, I suppose, approaches that would fall into that category?
Um, and that question is a little bit trickier because all stress management strategies work for some people. So I'm never going to say that this or that method isn't great. It's just that it might not be great for some individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But I will present a few examples and explain kind of what some of the issues can be. So this is not me saying that these methods do
Yes,
not work for autistic people, period, or that they are
sure.
not neurodiversity affirming, period. It's
Yeah,
more so that the ways that they often are used may not be. Mm.
sure.
Okay, so one example is mindfulness. In mindfulness, if we don't tailor it to the individual person's way of thinking, it can actually increase anxiety instead of helping. So one of the reasons can be that focusing on the body's inner signals, if you are anxious, can actually enhance that anxiety because now you're paying attention to it. Um, Or it can be that it's just overwhelming and scary if you're not used to noticing the signals that your body gives you. That can also be a reason. Or it can be things like with autistic people, you much more so need to instruct to accept stray thoughts coming in. That it's okay, that it's a normal part of the process, because otherwise a lot of us tend to think that they're not good at mindfulness meditation. And then that becomes a cycle of like, oh no, I got another stray thought. I'm so bad at this. I can't do it. And then it actually becomes harmful
Mm.
instead of helping. So we have to tailor it. We have to change it to suit the person. Another one is the to-do list, which in some ways, I can see how that would resemble energy accounting a little bit, because you are trying to pick and choose like what's important to do and how much does it weigh and things like that. But here's the thing, when people say just make a to-do list, they're saying just prioritize. And our executive functions makes that difficult
Mhm.
in the first place. Um, but then on top of that, the way that that our frontal lobes work, the executive functions, also makes it difficult to start on the tasks. And
Mhm.
then there comes the guilt and
Yes.
the shame and the, oh no, why can't I just, and we often tend to compare ourselves with other people thinking, other people are just able to do X, Y, Z.
Mhm.
Why can't I? I should not get any extra praise, or I should not get any extra um, supports because other people can do it without. And so any sort of strategy or method where we're not working to address that shame or that guilt or that way of thinking is less likely to be helpful. Um, there's also lots of strategies and methods that kind of require that you're able to participate in groups,
Yes.
which is naturally an issue. Or they assume that you have to get back to 100%, which I kind of talked about before, getting back to what you used to be able to do. Um, but on top of that, like a lot of us don't even know what 100% for us looks like, because we might be comparing again to other people whose
Yeah.
100% looks very different from ours. And we think I should be able to do that. And so we're trying to do something that doesn't actually make sense for our capacity as an individual. We have different strengths, different vulnerabilities, and we have to work with those. Um, and then um, methods that seem like too hopeful tend to not work for us, because they're unrealistic. So if someone comes along and says, this is going to just make everything much better, this is just going to fix everything for you, that for many of us is like, we can get seduced by it, but then it crashes and burns. Or
Yes.
it's like, no, that sounds like a lie. I don't even want to try it. So we can have reactions in those extreme. But I will say the number one thing is that if a method is inflexible, that's a sign for you that it's not neurodiversity affirming. Because being neurodiversity affirming is about being able to adapt to the
Mhm.
individual. And so if a method can't do that, then that's a red flag for me.
And I think that's a really important point because perhaps there's people on this call this evening, on this webinar this evening, and they've taken to Google or they've been recommended particular supports
Mhm.
or programs that they should consider. And would you encourage people to, I suppose, ask any particular program or practitioners, how is this program neurodiversity affirming?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question to ask. I also think that we should be prepared that a lot of professionals and organizations won't be able to answer that question.
Yes,
Um, and again, if they can't, then
that's a
maybe
sign
that's
in of itself. Exactly. Yeah.
but sometimes it's also just that they haven't thought about it in those terms. And that's not necessarily a red flag, in which case rephrase it. Say, can this method be adapted to my needs?
Yes. No, that's really helpful. And just to remind people at this stage in the evening, as we continue to work through the questions, at any stage as we're talking, if there's a burning question you have in your head, please do put it in the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to come to it at that stage in the webinar. I just want to talk a little bit about context-specific support, and I think this is something that's been coming
Mm,
up throughout the conversation. All of the time, there's this pressure to conform with the expectations of the neurotypical or the holistic world.
mhm.
So people maybe can understand this method and they can find that it works really well in their own home or in the context of their family. But maybe
Yeah,
they find it much harder to make it work within outside context or broader society. So maybe to look at a couple of areas in particular. How can you, I suppose, advocate for a strategy like this to work successfully within a school setting?
right. So with energy accounting specifically, I always want to bring the school on board. I always want to be working with a teacher if I can. I usually will want to start working with the favorite teacher, because that's a good place to start. But even before that, there can be barriers. So the first thing I want to address when it comes to school or work for that matter is to say, we need to recognize that when we're asking for support in these contexts, we're asking for that support because it's useful for us. And, you know, because of that, it's also useful for the school or workplace. It's not unreasonable questions that we're asking. It's not unreasonable supports we're asking for. So supports that allow you to better focus, to not get overwhelmed, or to feel physically or emotionally comfortable, or to feel confident to address the tasks that you're being given, such as receiving them in a particular format, which would make them more accessible for you. That helps the school do their job of teaching you, or it helps the workplace to get a better, happier employee, and often a more loyal employee too.
Mhm.
And so it's actually beneficial for the school or for the workplace as well. It's not that we're asking something from them and we are being given a gift by getting support. It's reasonable, actually. So that's the first barrier that I want to address. However, schools and workplaces often don't know that. So I tend to be very humble when I first talk to a school, and even the favorite teacher who can be a very, very lovely person, but maybe they don't know that they're actually helping that student so much.
Mhm.
I still want to address them with kind of that humility of saying, well, we have these ideas for ways that we can make the classroom more accessible for this student, ways that it can, make it easier for them to be there, easier for them to learn, easier for them to have the energy for the entire school day or the entire week. Um, and these are some of the ideas that we have, but how can we work together to make some of that happen? And we would be just so grateful. Oh, humble overlords. Um, sarcasm. But but how can we work together to make this happen? And um how can we make it okay for you to make these changes? Um, and so when it comes to energy accounting, it's very simple things that the school can do. It's actually just to have some of those practical strategies. So allowing the student, for example, to have a nonverbal signal with the teacher that I don't have the energy for group work today, or I need to leave the room briefly, um, or I'm about to have a meltdown. Uh, I need to go now, right now. Um, and sometimes it's simple things like for the teacher to say, um, you know, hey, Johnny, could you please go and fetch a thing for me? Or, if it's something that you don't want to draw attention to the diagnosis. And of course, if the classroom is one that is very accepting, then it can also just be, you look like you need a breather. Can you just step outside for 5 minutes, please? Um, and
I,
that's having those
I think
phrasings agreed upon. And then, of course, having that conversation between the school and the parents so that you have information.
consistency and information flowing.
Yeah.
Uh, I suppose one of the things as I'm listening, and we're talking a lot about this evening, this idea that autistic people are adapting all of the time. The world doesn't always adapt as much, and the consequence of that is people trying to fit into this world where the demands do not align with support needs, do not align with energy levels.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose one of the questions that I have in that regard is, we're probably about 6 weeks away from World Autism Month, and I spent a lot of my time today in meetings about it. And we talk about that shift between awareness and understanding and acceptance. And of course, if you like, the bridge between those two worlds is that idea of reciprocal change, that the world has to shift and meet halfway. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes within the narrative of the workplace, on the one hand, we have the kind of charitable tragedy narrative that is a barrier to the world of work. And on the other hand, we have this superpower narrative that is also a barrier to the world of work. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you think energy accounting can be a tool, I suppose, in terms of injecting a reasonable and mutual understanding of autistic support needs within the workplace?
I actually think that we need to start having a conversation about the fact that all people have support needs and that our support needs just happen to be these ones,
Hmm.
and not just autistic people's support needs happen to be these ones, but these specific autistic people haven't, as individuals, we have support needs. And having that conversation about it's not that my support needs are um, wild and crazy out there, completely alien. No, they're just slightly different. I need slightly different work environments in order to make me a happy and productive employee. And that's perfectly okay, actually. I I think um, I think we have to have a shift, and I can't quite say this without being political, and if that's a problem, I apologize. But I think we need to start having a conversation about that the employees are actually the ones creating value for a company. You know, they're the ones actually doing the work. And so if we're making it untenable for people to work, then what are we expecting exactly? And actually, I believe that if if our support needs are met as autistic people, we can be in the workforce. I think that we've proven this. Um, we can be in the workforce, we can contribute, and very often the support needs that we need in the workplace are such minor changes that they're not really actually costly. They're just different. That's all. And the fact is also that we're such a large minority that we cannot be ignored. We're talking about 2%, maybe more of the population. You can't ignore the fact that we exist, and we exist everywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
Um, and so that's
I'm sorry. I'm taken by that idea that all people have support needs, because
Mhm.
in AsIAm we often talk about this concept that things that might be essential to our community in some instances may actually be good for all.
Yeah.
And I suppose in the context of your book, you talk about energy accounting within the context of autism and related conditions or
Mhm.
diagnoses. But do you think a tool in which this discussion can become more mainstream is actually embedding this at a universal level within schools or workplaces?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that Tony and I say when we talk about energy accounting, because he's obviously my co-author, and
Yeah.
we very often have had the conversation that yes, because autism is our field, our primary field, that's kind of the context that we've written the book in. But energy accounting is not autism specific.
Hmm.
Anyone can use energy accounting, and probably a lot of people should, um, because we do live in a society that's very focused on being productive. And I think at some point we need to flip that conversation on its head and start talking about, what lives do we want to have, and how can we actually create schools, create workplaces that work for us, you know, not that it has to be the workplace giving us something, but that it has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. It has to make sense for us to be there. And it has to be a place where you feel respected and understood and met. And
Absolutely.
I think everyone actually needs that, because otherwise we wouldn't be having a global conversation about increasing levels of burnout in the
I
general
think that's right.
population.
Uh, I just want to, I suppose we've started that discussion about your book, which is entitled Energy Accounting, Stress Management and Mental Health Monitoring for Autism and Related Conditions. And I should say you can get it online. I got it on Apple Books, and we were talking about how it's still in color on iPhones. That's something people can think about as well.
Mm.
But just I suppose a question that I had was, you're obviously extremely active in the field of autism. You're active as a researcher. You're active as a clinician. Of all the topics you could write about, what brings your particular passion to write about this topic and this subject that we're talking about this evening?
Um, yeah. Okay. Um, so I'm not actually a researcher. I don't know. Does a thesis count?
I think so.
Uh, I actually, so when I was a teen, I'd already been struggling for many, many years, to cope with the daily stressors of just going to school and just existing in the world. And quite simply, energy accounting didn't exist and I needed it to.
Mhm.
And so I had to create it for myself. There were bits and pieces there. It's it's a weird thing for someone to admit, but I don't think I've created anything new. Um,
Sure.
every every bit of energy accounting, every little detail existed somewhere. I've just put them together, and created a framework. I think that makes sense. But when I had to learn how to deal with my own stress, I had to pick up those bits and pieces one at a time and, look at them and twist them and turn them upside down and go, what's this? How does it work? Can it work for me? And so it took me years to get anywhere with actually dealing with my own stress. And at the time, which is 20 years ago, um, the methods that were out there and the knowledge that was out there was, neurotypical, holistic professionals or parents, presenting the information to us in kind of a, this is what's good for you kind of way. And that didn't resonate with me. And so already back then, I had the thought of, why isn't there why aren't there therapies and methods that are created by autistic people for autistic people? Why isn't that there? Um, and so I think that was kind of the foundation for doing this. And then of course I started writing the book, and I had the thought that, I don't want to write a book about a method that just works for me. I
Hmm.
have to make sure that this is something that's actually useful to people, because otherwise, it felt too self-centered. I don't actually weirdly want to talk about me. I want to help people, you know. Um, and so then I've spent the last 10 years with Tony Atwood and with other colleagues around the world, implementing and testing energy accounting in a clinical setting to continue to learn, how can we actually make sure that this method is something that is adaptable, something that does work for lots of people. And and so it's been a passion project for many, many years. And meanwhile, the rest of the world started talking about burnout and
Yeah.
started talking about autistic burnout. And I sat there with this project being like, I'm actually already writing it, but okay.
Well,
Um,
I think anyone listening this evening, what worthwhile journey it has been. And I think as well, just hearing about that kind of process you went through, and at the same time thinking about the sea change we've seen in so many areas of our community, as we've heard more autistic voice, autistic experience, and more autistic professionals come through.
yeah.
It is truly phenomenal, the journey that has brought us on in a positive way. And now people will be delighted to hear that we've come to the portion of this evening in which there's an opportunity for others to get a word in edgeways over me and to ask a question. So I'm going to open it at this stage. If there's anybody through the Q&A box who'd like to put a question to Maja around anything we've discussed tonight or the broader topic of energy accounting. And just maybe while we're waiting for questions to come through, Maja, for people who are interested in learning about more, I know that you mentioned that you had a website, so I might just let you speak to that
Yeah.
this evening.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly let people know that there is a book. It exists as a physical book, but also as an ebook. Um, I want to note that on top of the 250-ish pages that is in the book itself, there's an additional 70 pages of downloadable material, which is accessible through JKP's website, but it's only on the US website. So please do go to their American website to get that additional downloadable material. Um, on top of that, I have created a website for energy accounting, which is quite simply energyaccounting.com. And on that website, you can find PDFs of downloadable handouts, which are completely free and will continue to be free. So you can go and download those and print them out and use them, whenever you need them. And as additional handouts become available, we're going to put them on that website, and any additional resources that we create will be there.
That's amazing. One question that we've received that I wanted to put to you is people on the call maybe who haven't come across energy accounting previously will have come across the concept of the spoons theory. And I
Yeah.
suppose, how does this complement or differ or add to the spoons theory?
Oh gosh. Okay. In lots of ways. So I didn't actually know about the spoon theory until years into um, even writing the book. So I was fairly far into it. The spoon theory is similar to the energy bank part of energy accounting, but energy accounting is so much more than that. There are more tools, and energy accounting is focused on not just the energy bank, but also building self-awareness of your stress capacity. It's got color coding, so talking about how can you actually use ways of tracking your energy visually in a calendar or a bullet journal or whatnot, to actually make it visually accessible to you what you're doing and why you're doing it. Energy accounting is something that we want to use to plan ahead, not just to think about day to day, but also weeks, months. Um, and on top of that, one of the central parts of energy accounting is that mental health monitoring. So monitoring your own stress symptoms, your well-being symptoms, which is something we talk about in the book, um, and having different monitoring strategies so that you can prevent future burnout.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Maya. And we have a few questions coming in. One viewer was wondering, how does energy accounting help with chronic fatigue syndrome? And they say that they feel they've recovered from ADHD burnout, but they're still struggling with energy from daily activities, for daily activities.
Mm. Okay. So, I mean, energy accounting is going to be something that you adapt to each different challenge that you have. So every person's energy accounting is going to look different. Chronic fatigue is going to mean that a large portion of what would otherwise have been your stress capacity is already spent on just having that fatigue and actually struggling through that. And so energy accounting is going to be about how can I utilize that remainder of my capacity, not go above my thresholds, not going to that warning signs space, not push myself too far. How do I create a life within that capacity that I do have available to me? Um, yeah, it's all about adaptation and monitoring and also recognizing sometimes that you can be doing too much with energy accounting as well. That's one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is we talk about in the book that you're allowed to not use all of energy accounting all the time. You
Okay.
can pick and choose the different tools that are available and use the ones that make sense at any given time. And so that's for me one of the adaptation bits that really makes sense when it comes to different challenges. I think I kind of missed the end of the question.
So I think the question was that the person felt they were coming through
Yeah.
the autistic burnout element or the ADHD burnout element, but
Mhm.
how this related maybe from a chronic fatigue perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we've
Cool.
somewhat covered that.
Sure. The questions are coming in pretty heavy now.
Yeah.
So the next question is from a teacher who's wondering, I suppose, what are some of the signs that you should look out for in terms of signs of possible burnout in students
hmm
or
Okay,
autistic burnout?
so actually for that, I will direct you to the downloadable material and to the book. As well as energyaccounting.com, we have one handout that is specifically about stress symptoms. And um, some of those will be acute stress symptoms, and some of them are more long term. So when you're watching for burnout specifically, I will say look for those signs that are more systemic. You can have one day that your student is complaining of a headache or just seeming low on energy or unfocused, whatnot. But if their overall behavior changes and you can see there are signs now that over weeks, months, this trend continues or perhaps even gets worse, that is a major, major sign that something is not going right. We all have off days and that's fine, but if we have off weeks, off months, that's an issue.
Thank you. The next question was somebody complimenting this evening, and they've already been on your website, and they see there's a section on courses, and they're wondering, do you have any plans to run courses that people can access?
Yes, so I'm actually working on one and I thought it was going to be quick. I thought it was going to be easy to do this. And then I started doing it and I realized this is actually going to take a really long time. I'm working on a course called the Strategy Toolbox, in which I'm going to go through lots of different strategies, long-term strategies, short-term strategies, strategies that are specifically targeted for autistic or ADHD people, practical strategies, and going into what is the strategy, how does it work, why does it work, give examples of how to do it, and what the barriers to using that strategy might be and how you can overcome that or which other strategies might be relevant. So that's actually kind of a juggernaut that I'm working on right now.
Well, I know we'll all be looking forward to when that work is complete, when it is in good time. And the next question, I suppose, is it possible for the cycle of burnout to be broken?
Yes, yes, it is. But what that requires is that our monitoring becomes uh, well enough worked on that we can recognize the signs and adapt in time. So
Okay.
burnout will always have a beginning that is nice and easy, and then it builds, or if you want to represent it as a dip, then, but that line always starts to change. And the more you get to know yourself, the more you get to know what your signals of stress or well-being are, the more you can recognize when that line begins to move. You see the warning signs earlier on and you can adapt. And so when you use energy accounting over time, and I'm not saying that you have to go through burnout after burnout after burnout until you know how to do this, but it's more so every day, every week that you spend getting to know what your symptoms are, what your signs are, it will become easier for you to recognize, oh, wait, things are going in this direction. What do I do now? And it is possible, but it's not quick and easy.
Thank you, Maya. The next question is, how can a parent guide a child through energy accounting? As it kind of seems like there's something that the person, the individual, needs to
Mhm.
buy into. But maybe
Yeah.
if you're a child, you're not interested, or you're not
Mhm.
aware of it. So how can a parent, I suppose, support with that engagement?
Yeah. So there are different things that you can do when you're working with children. One of them is to show them that this is not something that we only do with the child. So if they see that this is something that's useful for mom and dad too, or for older siblings, then that can become more interesting. Especially because if you are if you are the autistic child in the family, um, you're very used to being singled out as the one that interventions are aimed at. And so we really want to show them that this is not something that's got to do with their autism. This is just a way to manage your life and to make sure that you're doing well. Um, so that's one thing. The other thing is because of the relative simplicity of the energy bank portion of energy accounting, we can swap out the metaphors for lots of things that the child might find interesting. Um, and so, find a different metaphor. Budgeting isn't interesting for children, or for most children at least, and that's fine. It shouldn't be. So find something else. I've spoken with lots of children where I actually will talk to them like, well, you're a sim, right? Let's talk about the Sims. They have bars showing their needs, and when their needs get low, we need to do something about it. So energy accounting is just a way to talk about what your needs are at any given moment and how do we fill those. Um, or if they like to, play other computer games, then, your character has a health bar and they have some kind of magic they can tap into
Mm.
or something. Let's find something else that we can call it except, values or, whatever. Do something different with it. If they like to play board games, use board game markers.
A really interesting question has come in, I suppose, which is about, this is obviously a really healthy way of living life, but how do you balance this in terms of survival? And that might be in a socioeconomic context. It may be, we have international attendees here this evening. It may be in terms of the context in which you live globally. How do you kind of balance the benefits of energy accounting with monetary, housing, feeding yourself, that kind of baseline
Yeah.
survival?
Yeah. And there's always a point at which we have to just be realistic about what we can change. And that's one of the things that we do acknowledge in energy accounting, is that there's going to be an optimal, and then there's going to be what is actually possible. We want to make changes where we can, and any changes that we can make in order to make your life easier, we want to make those changes. If there's a change that we really wish we could make, but we can't, then that's something we keep wishing for and hoping for being possible in the future. But right now, we acknowledge that it's not. Actually, in the very beginning of the book, there's a case example with an adult, an autistic adult, who lives in a kind of student housing kind of. There's a lot of trauma for them connected to living in that space, but they can't move. The best thing for them would actually to move home with their parents, but that's not possible. So we acknowledge that and we say, okay, well, what changes can we make? What plan can we make for changes to happen in the future? And of course, to revisit that plan every so often to see how far have we actually gotten, what changes have there been in the life situation, what is possible now. But it's an unfortunate part of life that practicality does exist, and possibilities aren't always what we want them to be.
I know, thank you so much. And we're coming towards the end, but maybe we have time for another couple of
Yes, we do.
questions.
If
And
you've
the
got the
next
time,
one,
I've got the time.
oh, you're very generous. So, how do you support a teen who wants to push through burnout rather than taking time to treat or manage it? They don't want to draw attention to themselves.
Mm. Right. So that is always tricky, and it depends very much on that specific teen. But one of the things that I would start with is to get psychoeducation for them on the consequences of burnout on a nervous system level. If they are a person who's capable of processing that type of information, that's a place I would go, because we may be very stubborn to make changes, but if we understand that on a very practical, like physiological level, our nervous systems are being damaged.
Mm,
They are being actually injured over time, and we continue to injure them if we keep going down that path. That becomes, for some at least, kind of an eye opener,
mm,
kind of okay, I don't want to draw attention to myself, but I also don't want to lose my memory.
mm,
I don't want to hinder um, my development of my frontal lobes, which is going to be my ability to prioritize, to plan, um, to monitor my own behavior and my own emotions and my own state. I actually need those parts of my brain to develop and to function. Um, Wait, I actually don't want the physical health problems that come with long-time burnout, which can be things like um, chronic pain, or it can be increased risk of heart problems. Uh, there are so many things. I don't know what things people have read and what they haven't, but as a parent, I would guide you to read a book called The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke-Harris. Um, your child may not want to read that book, but I think it's such important knowledge to have when you're dealing with a child who is pushing themselves through stress. because it tells you how important this is. And it also tells you what are the ways that we can come out of it. And just to tack on, there are 5 areas that we really want to focus on, which we definitely also want to focus on in energy accounting. But just to sum up very, very quickly, we want nutrition, just plain, normal, healthy nutrition. We don't want to go overboard. It doesn't have to be religious, just normal, good nutrition. We want exercise. We don't want intense, high interval training exercise, because if you're already stressed, that's actually a little bit tough on your nervous system. So moderate exercise is great. Go for walks, go on Pokemon hunts in Pokemon Go, do things like that. We want sleep. Anywhere that we can increase quality of sleep, we want to do that. We want good experiences and good deeds, anything that gives you a feeling of having done something good. That feeling, we want to get it. And then we want community. Those are the 5 things we want.
That's really comprehensive. Thank you, Maja. How do you practice energy accounting if you've difficulty with interoception and/or alexithymia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's really a point where I want
This
to
is
be
our last
working.
question for the evening.
Okay, that's a point where I would want to be working with someone else, someone who can help to talk you through some of those aspects that are difficult. I also definitely would recommend that you have the handouts available, because just having lists of physical symptoms to look at can help you to consider them and identify them. So when you're doing your brainstorming, when you're doing your monitoring, have those lists in front of you, but also go through with someone else, what do these things actually feel like for you? Because if you have difficulties with interoception and you do experience alexithymia, then your experience of emotional states or stress symptoms may come across differently. So we want to try to identify how, any way that you can actually do it. And then one thing that we do in energy accounting is that we use other people to monitor. So if possible, have other people help you to identify some of those stress symptoms. So the handout that we have, which is also in the book, but it's also on the website, it's downloadable. One of the columns is behavioral. So that's things that other people can see. So are there changes in your behavior that can actually be warning signs for others to notice that they can help to talk you through?
Thank you.
So lots of things like that. Yeah. Sorry.
Maja, I just want to say a huge thank you on behalf of everybody for sharing with us so generously this evening. There's been many kind comments posted in the chat box and the Q&A box, and I know that people have gotten an awful lot out of this, as will people who receive this webinar in the coming days via email with some follow-on resources, including your website, which of course we've mentioned, but is energyaccounting.com. And it's always a particular pleasure for us when we get to spotlight autistic practitioners and advocates like yourself who are making such a difference. And we really encourage people who might be interested to support your work and to purchase the book. If people have enjoyed the webinar this evening, please do know that we do these webinars regularly, and you can find out about our forthcoming webinars on our website, AsIAm.ie. If we didn't get to your question this evening and you'd like further information or support, you can, of course, get in touch with us via the Autism Information Line, which can be contacted by phone, and the details are on our website, or on support@asiam.ie. And of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that if you found this evening useful, to put on webinars like this, we always appreciate your support, and you can make a donation through asiam.ie. But thank you very much, everybody, and particularly thank you, Maja, and have a nice evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody.